So, who has heard of Flutter before? Excellent, everyone. Who's writing apps in Flutter right now? Okay. Who wants to be writing apps in Flutter? Not everyone raised their hand. Interesting. That's surprising because Flutter is awesome. I've been doing Android development for close to a decade now, and I love it. It's fun, but there are parts of it that can be kind of frustrating. From a business perspective, because I own a business, I have to think about things from two sides of it now too. Not every person needs to have two unique versions of their application, but they still want to have a really nice user experience. The developer experience on Flutter is outstanding. It's what the web has had for a very long time with hot reloads and things like that. Being able to see changes immediately, and just it's fun to work in. We've shipped our first app in Flutter. It went out about 2 months ago. Clients loved it. Our team loved it. I'm usually, expecting with new technologies that there's a point where, you're going to hit something that's like, okay, I know that this is going to come and bite us, and it's going to be, 90% of the project. We didn't really hit that. It was solid and just a really good experience. But it being awesome, you can't do everything yet. So why is that? Basically, at its core, Flutter is just a game engine that you embed into an app. It's not going to be a self-contained app. You don't build your own executable out of Flutter yet, future. It's just a tool that we can add to our toolbox to get things done. It's not going to try to re-implement your operating system. You've got one, use it. And with it being a game engine, what it tries to do is, if it's going to provide UI type feedback and UI type interactions, it's going to create its own implementation of material design or the human interface guidelines Apple provides. It's not actually using those real components. So if you're looking like a tool like React Native, they'll actually use those components and bridge it differently. So slightly different architecture, pros and cons both ways. But at the end of the day, it takes care of doing all of the drawing itself, which works out well almost all the time. Architecturally wise, way down at the very bottom, you've got your platform. You run iOS, you run Android, whatever it is. There's your operating system. That operating system exposes a whole lot of really interesting capabilities that you might want to use in your app, and they expose those through SDKs. The applications you could build, whether you do it with React Native or Flutter or Ionic or Xamarin or whatever, are going to interact with those SDKs. You're going to have things that might be specific to iOS or Android. If you're doing encryption on Android, you might use key store. If you're doing it on iOS, you might use keychain to kind of manage all of those different encryption keys. You're going to pull in third-party libraries. Firebase is an example of a third-party library that you might pull in just to take care of, push notifications or deep linking or, authentication or things like that. Things that, people provide. Here's how to do this with Android, or here's how to do this with iOS. Not always going to have the case with, oh, here's this thing for Flutter too. But sometimes you want to be able to leverage that. So then, where does that leave us? Well, we've got this, purple box up in the top corner that's, kind of disconnected from everything else. We'd like to be able to interact with the host operating system. We'd like to be able to interact with, all of these third-party libraries. We'd like to be able to leverage platform-specific code where it makes sense. So this is going to be a really awesome graphic. It extends out with a plugin. So Flutter is extensible through a plugin mechanism. And what that lets you do is it gives you hooks and callbacks into all the different areas of the platform that you'd be normally used to interacting with. So if you've been doing Android or iOS for 10 years, everything that you're familiar with is immediately available, and then you're able to take that and surface it through your app. Does that kind of make sense? So we kind of talked about, that's a way that you can take this data and bring it forward into your app. Right now, there's 3 different ways that you can kind of interact with the platform.
If you don't need a user interface, components to bring forward, and you're just looking for data, like you want to ask, are biometrics enabled on the device? That's not going to be something that's built into the Flutter SDK. Doesn't need to be, but it is something that you can ask Android or iOS or whatever. Hey, is this enabled? You might want to have a different UI behavior around that. Your app only cares about is biometrics enabled. It doesn't care about all the underlying security systems and things like that. Sometimes you might have a native widget or view that you want to surface up into your app. As an example that we use, we were building this application and we were using Lottie for little micro animations and things like that. The designers love this tool. So we were able to take this native Lottie view that takes care of these animations, bring it forward in our app, and it just kind of worked. So in the cases like that where someone has provided some specific part of your UI, yeah, you can leverage that too. And the third one that I have not had a chance to touch with or do anything with, so I have very little to talk to us about. If you have native compiled code, so stuff that you've taken with C or C++ or Kotlin native and compiled down, you can actually execute that directly from the Flutter engine without needing to go back down through Objective-C or Swift or Kotlin or Java and somewhere else. So you can skip some of that stuff. But that's still beta. Haven't touched it, looks kind of cool. Haven't had a good use case for it yet. If you're looking at a lot of the documentation that's out there around doing platform views and method channels and things like that, one of the words that or two of the words that they kind of interchange loosely, it can be kind of confusing, especially if you're trying to say, hey, I want to figure out a little bit more about this, but you end up down a rabbit hole of a wrong query. The plugins and packages. A plugin is an implementation of some behavior. A package is a distribution of that. So if you've been doing Android, an AR file or a jar file would be a package. If you've been doing stuff with iOS, a CocoaPod would be a package. The things that live inside of that would be the plugins, the implementation. Does that kind of make sense? And I only bring that up because I lost hours trying to figure out why am I not getting the results I'm wanting, but searching for the wrong thing. So let's take a look at the first one, method channels. Method channels, if you're familiar with building REST APIs or just typical RPC, here's this request, give me a response. Here's this request, give me a response. If you're familiar with that type of interaction, this is the model you're looking after. Everything in here is asynchronous. One of the things that they built into the entire Flutter model is that most things are asynchronous. Because the world is asynchronous, and they've made that really easy. So, as you're building out your solutions, you need to think about, I'm not going to have an immediate reply to this. I've got to, plan in. It might be a loading state. It might be a something. As with everything on Android, if you're trying to update the UI from not the main thread, and same thing on iOS, it'll crash your app. Not specific to Flutter. It's just a side effect of trying to do that type of stuff. Main threads for UI updates, background threads are for other things. But, because you're sending a response back to this thing running on your main process, you've got to send it, take care of it on your main thread. There's some libraries that you can pull in, like I think some of the Google Places things, they will give you a response back, not necessarily on your main thread. So if you're building out a method channel implementation, you need to make sure of where you're sending things back to. If you're doing things like listening to a stream of events that might be coming off of a Bluetooth device, or you're listening for the current state of the user's battery, things that would be like a stream of events that would happen over time. There's another channel called an event channel that follows the same type of model. Things are asynchronous. The setup's a little bit different. If you've done things with either Firebase before, or listeners, or RX, it's that type of model. So an event stream. And there's documentation on how to get started with platform channels. Architecturally wise, you end up with a lot of shared Flutter code that gets built on for Android and iOS. As an example, you'll have a method, that you would say, I care about is biometrics on. I don't care about how it's implemented in iOS. I don't care how it's implemented on Android. I just want to know the answer. If you're making a REST request over a network, you don't care about where something is stored in a database. That's an implementation detail. Same type of thing over here. Is biometrics on Android? That's an implementation detail. The higher parts of your app just don't care about that. The Dart code, this is literally a complete example. Getting rid of the stuff that we don't care about that's specific to Dart and Flutter. That's it. You bring in one specific import that pulls in things that let you use method channels out of an import. You declare a method channel, which is going to be a named channel. They use that to map requests coming from the Flutter runtime into the native platforms. We'll take a look at that in a second. I mentioned that everything is asynchronous, so if you look at this block, it's an asynchronous block, and inside of there, we're going to wait for get my platform to return. If it's on Android, it's going to return Android. If it's iOS, it's going to return iOS. I'm usually one that's down for live coding. I love doing it, but I'm not going to juggle 3 different IDEs and 2 different emulators. I'll get seasick, and I think everyone else will too. So all the code is going to be up here. But if you're interested, we can jump back into the editors later and see actually running code for this. If something fails, typical try-catch, statements. The syntax is going to be Dart specific, but the flow is about kind of I think what you'd expect in close to every language. So nothing terribly surprising there. So what is that? 1, 2, really 2 interesting lines from the Flutter side to call into the platform sides. On the Android side.
Can I ask you a question?
Huh?
Can you back up a second? So we set the state, and I don't know Dart, so I don't know what the next operator does. How do I know, do I have something else that's listening to my platform value? If I wanted to do something with that value, now that I got it involved.
So yeah, my platform value up here is just an instance variable. If you wanted to set it up so something else was listening to it, you could wrap it in like an observable or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, at that point you can do whatever you want because it's been passed back up to you. And
Okay, I just wasn't sure what that little sugar there was, the parentheses and
okay,
the arrow.
yeah. So.
Sorry, I don't mean to get down a rabbit hole.
Oh no, you're fine. So this is basically passing in a lambda, an anonymous function, into a function called setState, and that triggers a rebuild of that next frame of the UI. Okay. So as a response to this coming in, we're going to update our instance variable up here with what came in. Indicate that the UI has been refreshed, which will then go down here and rebuild that widget tree with the new value.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Android side, again, this is a complete implementation. You get rid of the stuff that isn't specific to this. You're going to create an instance of a Flutter channel. Give it a reference to the view that's being displayed. In this case, your Flutter runtime is going to be running inside of a single Android view. This name here corresponds to that name, 1 for 1. You're going to set up a listener that says, anytime, something gets called on this channel with a method named called getMyPlatform, which lines up with 1 for 1 with this. I'm going to return Android. If they call anything else on this, because I haven't implemented it yet, we're going to throw up an error, indicating that this hasn't been built out yet. That's it. Replace result.success with Android of whatever the platform code is that says is biometrics enabled, whether it's or any other platform feature that you build out and need to respond to in your UI. That's it. Performance is crazy fast. There's a handful of different ways you can encode values going back and forth. So if you have specific use cases, I think I read a blog post a month or so ago. Someone was using or encoding things with protobuf because they had complex objects they were trying to send back and forth across the wire. They can do that type of stuff too. iOS side, a little more code,
But when we get rid of the stuff that doesn't really matter, you get a reference to your Flutter View controller. On the Android side, we had a reference to a Flutter View. We're going to create a new method channel, same platform name, set up a callback, and anytime someone says, get my platform, return iOS. Result iOS could be, is biometrics enabled, or whatever other feature you want. That's all the code for it.
Is there any, like, when you were doing this, did you run across any, how do you test this, I guess? Like this code right here, like that it returned iOS in this case?
Well, I started up my emulator, I ran the app, and it said iOS, and I moved on. I don't have a good answer for the story on how to test this right now.
Okay.
Other than if I was wanting to test this out on the Flutter side, I would probably wrap all of the method channel stuff in an object that kind of works as like a repository or interactor or something. But then I can mock that out. So then the method channel stuff becomes an implementation detail that I'm subbing in and out. Seeing how it impacts the Flutter side of the app. As for end-to-end testing, I don't know.
I think you could do the same if you wanted to unit test the Swift or Kotlin side. You would just, like, at some point, like, you could write a test for that switch statement. You just extracted it out. Like, you had something that said, like, method handler. You pass in the stuff, and then you just unit test that, because it's just going to be an object that takes something and returns something.
Can you run like unit tests with any individual platform? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, yeah.
Are you able to do that?
Hmm?
Oh, okay.
You're
Yeah.
just given, like, three, like, you just have an Android project, an iOS project, and then a Dart project.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yep. In that case, I'd grab whatever arguments out of here and then pass it into something else, and then processes all that.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that handles if you've got behavior you want to pull forward and surface inside of your app. If you have things that in your UI that you want to pull forward, in our example, a lot of you, how do we show all these micro animations where there's already a platform implementation of how to show this, and we don't have to rewrite it in Dart or pull in a library that the ones that are out there were still kind of buggy, but lots of similarities. Everything with it is asynchronous. All it does is expose the UI bits of the app. So if it's the pixels you see, or the gestures that go into it, that's all it does. If you need to pass in commands, pair it up with the method channel. So every platform view can have an associated method channel with its own unique identifier that you can interact with it back and forth. Because of the way they draw things on the screen currently, there is a higher cost to performance when you're rendering things. Basically you end up with this surface view that then gets, they grab a frame of that, redraw it with the rest of the application, and then push it off to the screen. So, not the most elegant of, processes. A Flutter app can basically say, draw everything, and it doesn't really have to do any compositing. This one, a little bit more work. But in all of our tests, even with, animations and things like that, cameras, maps, web views, whatever, performance is great, with some caveats. The only thing that's kind of that they don't really call out in the documentation is that you have to be explicit. When you're giving a platform view, you have to say, I want it to be this size. You're setting up the constraints that any rendering it does has to fit inside of here, instead of the platform view saying, oh, I'm going to render a button and I need it to be this size. If you want to do that, you probably have to do some extra hops, but ultimately you're saying, I want to have a surface texture to draw into of some size, and that takes care of the rest.
You say it's rendering off screen?
The
platform view, it's rendering off screen?
I believe so, or whatever it does if you have a surface view or texture view on the platforms. So, I think so. When you if you're trying to think about how this manifests itself into your application stack, think of
your Flutter application is going to have a widget that says, I'm going to accept all of these OpenGL or 2D commands to render some image into some box. To do that, they're going to reach into the platform and say, okay, now give me the native component that lets me do rendering into this box. You know, if you're building a video player in Android or iOS, it'll be that same kind of underlying widget, you know, that lets you do that rendering. And then your application draws into that. So caveats to that, because it has to be a fixed size. If your child widget that you're trying to show, you know, it has a dynamic height to it or dynamic sizes to it, you know, you're going to end up clipping and you'll spend a few hours wondering, why is this not showing? Well, it's showing, but it's not actually coming through the rendering pipeline because it's not being composited out because this is the size I told it to use. Same thing with, you know, z-axes and things like that. If you wanted to shove something kind of in underneath this, you know, it's not gonna fly. If you're trying to render something flat on top of something else, it's gonna work perfect. Does that make sense? Don't do this. We had these little, you know, micro animations indicating, you know, whether something was, you know, loading or stalled or something like that, and we're showing a collection of those, and all of a sudden we were wondering, what in the hell happened to our app performance? Well, it turns out it doesn't matter where you're at. If you put in, you know, 16 of these little texture views, doesn't matter what you're doing on Flutter or Android or iOS, you're going to hose yourself. So this is how I learned about what it's doing behind the scenes. So you know, there are limitations. You know, if you're showing, you know, something full screen, you know, because the compositing only has to do it for, you know, one view, now you're not going to notice any performance hits. If you start, you know, adding in multiple of these things, you know, you could start seeing some hits to your performance. So yeah, don't be like me. Don't do that. You know, implementation-wise, you know, there is more complexity to the way that things are set up with platform views. You know, a lot of, you know, similarities. You know, in our case, we created a Lottie view on the Flutter side, or just a Lottie widget. It's going to look a lot like the other code that we had. But then you have to set up a platform registry that says, okay, whenever someone asks for this, here's the builder that knows how to instantiate that. So then you got to create a builder, and then the builder knows, okay, whenever I'm asked to build something, I can create this type of view or widget or, you know, whatever it is. So, you know, a few more interactions because you're doing some more complex things and actually creating longer-lived things other than just answering a question. Again, total complete examples. You know, so I didn't try to format things well. It just, they all fit on the screen. So, you know, kind of a testament to how easy it is to get up and running with some of these things. We talked about, you know, making sure that you've got an explicit height set for these child views. So in this example, I'm creating a button that, you know, is native to Android or native to iOS. If you're on the Android side, we're going to return a new Android view, which is Flutter's implementation that, you know, bridges out into Android code. If you're on the UI or iOS side, it's UIKit. And if you're on some platform that we don't know what it is, we'll just show a text view that says, we don't know where you're at. If you need to do some logic after that view has been created, they give you a callback called onPlatformViewCreated. At that point, you can do whatever else you need to do to, hey, this view has been loaded, now let's start doing interactions with it. You know, getting rid of the stuff that, you know, isn't specific to this, you know, that's an if statement, and returning a few views. So not a whole lot there. On the Android side, again, not a whole lot of code. Complete example. Setting up, you know, getting a reference to your plugin registry, adding in your factory, creating your factory. You know, the factory creates a view. The view is a platform view, which is a Flutter class, which then returns your actual Android button. iOS side has a little more code. You know, getting rid of the stuff you don't care about. You know, this is basically it. You know, same type of thing. Setting up a plugin or adding a factory to a plugin. The factory creates a platform view. The platform view renders the native code. there's a few hops and skips and a jump, but you know, it kind of makes sense when you look at what's going on. And we'll take a look at what this actually looks like in real life when I don't have to like switch between slides and emulators. I mentioned earlier that yeah, Chong.
Before you go on, like, this is where you're having Dart code creating a native platform view.
Yep.
So you go the opposite direction where your iOS code or your Android code calls and creates a, I guess, Flutter view, or?
You can. It's still experimental. I've not done anything with that yet.
So it is possible.
Yeah. Yep. So if you had an existing application and you wanted to start leveraging Dart or Flutter, yeah, it's possible. It's still not really well documented.
Okay.
What is maintaining the life cycle on those objects? Is that Flutter code?
Mm-hmm. Yep, because Flutter is basically going to be responsible for listening to that call to initiate this, and then it'll take over responsibility after it's been created.
When would that button be allocated?
I don't know the answer. I've not run into memory leaks, so I imagine it's being taken care of for us.
That's how I handle all my memory leaks.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that one. Somewhere in here there is a dispose method on one of the plugins. So they do have that callback available. So if you need to like clear out references or things like that. I can't remember where in this though it is, but we talked a little bit earlier, you know, if you have existing native code that you want to leverage, you can pull that in. You know, if you're requires all the native tools you'd expect, so like CMake on iOS and Android. Documentation for it is out there. Not something I've touched, so but it's new. We talked about being careful with the number of native platform views that you pull forward, just because of the compositing overhead that comes along with having that many different things that it's trying to add up together. One of the things about the Flutter developer experience is hot reload. Being able to see a change in your application before you can hit Alt-Tab to go to your next screen is incredible. But if you're changing native code, you're back into what you'd expect before. You've actually got to rebuild your application and redeploy it out there, because you're not running inside of that Dart VM that supports hot reload. You're actually changing the application. So the hot reload goodness goes away when you're doing this type of stuff. But in the course of your project, you may only have to be doing it 5 or 6 times, depending on what your needs are. One of the reasons I didn't do live coding is because I've got VS Code up for Flutter. I've got Android Studio up to open up the Android side of the project, and I've got Xcode open up to work on the iOS part of the project to all kind of manage this. Juggling all of that can be a little overwhelming, and it makes me glad that I have a big fat Mac Pro to have all those IDEs open, especially with Android Studio. And if you've been doing anything with Flutter Web or looking at that, plugins aren't there yet. So coming soon. Greg.
So like on a big project where you have multiple developers, where do you usually draw the division? Especially if you have some native code that you need to interact with. Do you have somebody just, do you have the person who's working on the Flutter code just put in just a hook into the native side, and then someone else writes that, or?
So the question is, where do you delineate the responsibilities?
Yeah.
Probably depends on your team makeup. Getting it started with Flutter, I think is pretty easy, regardless of if you're coming from iOS or Android. Knowing that you only may have to do a little bit of Swift, you're not going to catch fire if you have to go in there and make some changes.
Can't run Xcode on this working computer.
Well, he makes the code changes, he commits, he waits for the build server to tell him he did it wrong. I kind of look at it from the implementation side of, where does it make sense to actually set up those delineations? If you're making a network request to like an API, you've abstracted out some behavior. You're not concerned about the database behind the scenes. Same type of thing here. You care about some behavior without being concerned about that and taking it down to that level. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Any other questions? None, really?
So you said you have a single app that you've actually deployed out for like a professional app that you actually had a
Yep.
client pay for. How much of the code how much of it was from the native platforms? How much of it was iOS code? How much of it was Android code? How much of it was Flutter code?
The micro animations, we brought forward the third-party libraries that did all that rendering and just surfaced it through a platform view. So leveraging a third party there. We cared about ensuring that biometrics were enabled on the device, so that way it wasn't an entirely unlocked device, because we had to care about HIPAA and things like that. We were leveraging encryption, so using Keychain on Apple and Keystore on Android to let the OS manage that AES encryption key for us. I feel like there's one other spot that we're using it, but those are the big ones. Yeah. And then
I'm assuming that's the largest draw for Flutter, is the fact that it's cross-platform, right?
the developer experience, it being cross-platform is nice. The fact that you can create really compelling and interesting user interfaces quickly, I think is the bigger selling point. I would say from a cost perspective, building a Flutter app is 65 to 70% of the cost of building it on two platforms, because you still need to make sure that it runs well and it works well on Android and iOS. So between discovery and then the overlap of kind of making sure that things still work, it's not just a half off deal. But what we're able to implement from our design team versus trying to do it native is night and day. All the math is the same, but you're able to then reinvest in the stuff that they're coming up with versus trying to do it either twice or trying to figure out how to shoehorn something into a platform component versus here's this game engine and you can render whatever you want. So a little more flexibility. So yeah, different trade-offs you're making. And the emulation layer that they create is not a perfect implementation. I'd say it gets 97 or 98% of the way there. You had a question?
I had a little trouble hearing this, so I want to make sure I understood this. So you're saying if you developed the Android app first, it was 100% of the cost. Adding the iOS would add another 65%?
I would have to think about what the math looks like going that way. If you're building it out for both platforms at the same time, I would say ballpark 35% savings.
Over double?
Yep.
Okay. So 165% for two apps?
Yep.
Yes, okay.
Yep. So there's definitely something to be said for that, and then being able to reinvest in other areas. So, and some of that is just the QA of making sure things work on both platforms, and then also just the discovery that comes along with every project. And every project is going to have a different value in that, but that's kind of I think a decent starting point for that discussion.
I guess at Google I/O, they had this presentation or this initiative called Kotlin First, which to me sounds like, okay, we want to make sure all new SDKs, new frameworks actually work with Kotlin first, as opposed to any other language like Java or Flutter. What do you think about that? Does that mean that Google is serious about Flutter, or is it like really a second-class citizen?
I think they complement each other.
Okay.
I don't think that they step on each other's toes at all. The platform example code that I had, yeah, this is Kotlin. So, I'm writing an app with Flutter, but man, if I had to write that in Java, the screen would be 5 times that size. So when I come down to this level, I definitely want to use this or Swift or something like that.
So the fact that maybe a year from now they might not put as many resources on Flutter, is that ever a concern, or is that just, well, you don't deal with them now?
It's a concern with every Google product we touch. Yeah, there's always that thing in the back of your head going, is this going to get shut down and am I going to get screwed? I haven't seen that out of their trajectory right now. They seem to be putting a lot more resources and investment into it, and the way the community has adopted it, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. That said, there's always that risk because it's Google. But it is 100% open source, so it's not like they're going to pull it and then everyone is totally hosed. But no.
Gives you a warning if they pull something. Say it'll be gone in X amount of years or months or whatever, and you have a date. Apple doesn't do that. They just shut stuff off.
It gives you plenty of time to go and find a Caribbean island to go move to and turn off your email. Yeah. Yep. But yeah, kind of going back to your question, no, I don't think that there's a cannibalism between either of those technologies. I think they complement each other. Yeah, I don't want to go back to a world where I'm writing Java over Kotlin all the time. So, if I'm at this level, yeah, I want to use the better tool for it.
Have you seen any size limitation with, say, you needed to pass a ton of JSON over through a method channel to the native platform? Is there any, because I've seen that before where Android, you tried to parcelize a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, the parcel transaction too big exception or something, and then you spend 3 days trying to figure out where exactly it's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't tried to test that upper bound.
Okay.
Everything I've been passing forward is, primitives.
Yeah. Just imagine if you had a native database implementation on iOS and Android, you wanted to store a list of stuff you got back from the server for later use. Might be a problem.
Yeah, I think it all depends on the size. And on Android side, what is it, 512 kilobytes, I think is what it's at right now, before you hit that transaction too large exception and realize that your next few days are going to suck.
I could think of a coupon list app where that might be a problem.
Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure what the upper bound for that is.
Okay.
I know that they do give you different codecs. I don't know if there's a boundary in there where there's some upper limit enforced, but if you're passing things over JSON and you're hitting an upper limit, maybe look at protobuf or something like that and see if it can encode it into a smaller payload.
Squeeze it down as much as possible.
Yep. Yep.
So you can only pass primitives?
They give you a few out-of-the-box codecs. One of them is like a simple codec and then the JSON codec. And what the JSON one does is it basically gives you a dictionary or a map on either side. And you're responsible for knowing where to go grab things.
You want to pass the image through, do you do something else?
The byte array. And we're doing that too, using a native or a Flutter camera plugin to grab images off the camera and then running it through a processor or a transformation on the Dart side and storing that off the byte stream natively, because then we're encrypting it before it hits disk. And yeah, no crashes yet.
Speaking of crashes, what about Crashlytics or analytics plugins, things like that?
The story sucks.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to know when your application has a fatal crash. But with the way this works, because you're working inside, if your Flutter or Dart code runs into a failure, it basically gets reported back up as a non-fatal because they handle it and try to move on. So as one of the things I would like to see that story improved on out of Google with Firebase. If something crashes for a stupid reason, I want to know about it, and treat it as with the urgency that it deserves versus trickling in on a different intake process with a different notification strategy. Yeah. If it fails, email me.
Yeah.
I haven't tested out other tools yet. So, yeah. So, yeah, I wish that was a story that was a little bit better than it is, but it'll get there with something. Any other questions?
I have a question on that whole difficulty asking, so bear with me.
Yeah, no problem.
So I dug around on the Flutter site, looked around, said, oh look, here's a re-implementation of the iOS date picker and buttons and all that happy stuff, and all that kind of makes sense to me. One particular thing I'm looking at this thing for was really share sheet, activity sheet dependent, and so I was thinking about your trying to re-implement the share sheet system for iOS for taking out of scope.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's possible by the private APIs. And so I'm starting to, if you have a view that's your Flutter view, and then you want to pull in an iOS provided view that essentially is your share sheet that you can put over on top, is that something that you could do? And just, can you overlay an iOS rendered view on top of this view?
Yeah. So
you talked about your little boxes here.
So what you would do.
Is that the right way to think about this?
Yeah.
Have a view that would be.
So, in this case, your widget tree up here, is it's building up this platform view inside of it. You would set up probably a stack view with the platform view laying on top of everything else. That said, whenever I trigger this action, I want to ensure that the platform view is being displayed on top of everything else, and it should come in with all the transparency and everything like that.
Okay. Well, the iOS,
Yeah.
I just checked just to make sure it's actually not transparency. Yay. One thing gets simple. And so I was just trying to make sure I understood this. And so I would have to pick the size of the screen. Can I render off screen if the iOS one changes size, just to be really annoying?
Here's that Flutter app with the share sheet.
Okay. And so if you punch that guy, can it get tall?
Yeah, this is a native share sheet.
So it is a native share sheet. Is that a plugin you got out of someplace on their site, or is that something you had to write?
That's probably 3 in the morning code from a volunteer event.
Okay.
So,
Okay. But
maybe.
I understand how these pieces work together.
Yeah.
Kind of feeling
I
together.
was trying to pull that code up while you were.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, those brain cells got burned, so I'm not sure how we implemented it, but
Okay.
it's working.
No, great. That's all I need.
Yeah.
It's possible it can be done. Yeah. You guys got it. Let's do it.
But I don't think it's using, my guess is it's not using the
Probably not.
platform view, it's using the method channel to call some method that
Yep.
does that over it.
Because I was looking on the Flutter site, and the one that they had was iOS.
Yeah. So in that case, the platform is probably drawing its share sheet over top of the application. So
It'd be like a different window. Like keyboard on iOS is another window on top of your app, so it's something like that.
Okay.
I bet if you pulled it up in like Reveal or something, you'd see multiple windows.
Well, and that was going to be another question: is can you do that? Because they did have a picture on their site where they hooked up the Xcode view debug stuff. Basically, said it's a flat square, and you know nothing about what's going on inside of it, and I immediately panicked. The idea of not having something like Reveal would drive me crazy.
yeah, so kind of looking at the code,
Tools.
if you're looking for,
Not like Xcode.
yeah, if you're looking at Reveal or the Xcode View Debugger, the Flutter app is going to look like a big box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like this big box with like a share sheet on top.
Yeah. So
Okay, I was just trying to get a mental model to try and understand. Thank you.
Dark mode looks pretty bad on this one.
preferences, settings, theme. There we go. So this is all the real code that was running. So Android button, actually rendering out a material Android button. iOS, I've got it, ignore that it's reloading it, but I've got it set up so that the highlighted state for that UI button is set to red. Looking at Xcode, sorry Brandon, it's gonna be dark. It's really creating a UI button, setting the title, setting some colors, and setting the frame size for it. That's it. The Android story is pretty similar.
You get the debug attached to that process.
Yeah, if you're
if you're running the Flutter app out of iOS, you can like set up a breakpoint here and it'll hit it.
You should be able to hit the debug menu attached to that simulator.
Let's come back to that in a second because I was going to show, if I can find VS Code again, the white window. So now VS Code is running the iOS app. It's connected to that device. If I go to debug, you do Flutter Open DevTools Widget Inspector page. And assuming your tools are up to date, it'll open up a browser in just a second and kind of give you a not quite the same type of view that you would expect with Xcode and the view debugging, but it'll let you see kind of what that widget tree looks like. And if I had my simulator in the same window and go back to, if I had my simulator in the same window, are you getting seasick yet? You see why I didn't live code? And I make this a little bit smaller. You know, it should highlight where all the different things are. It should. It's not. Oh, select widget mode. There we go. So you do get some insights into kind of where things are at on the screen relative to, instead of it being just kind of that flat z-index type of view that you would get in a debug simulator or in Xcode. It's more that widget tree view that maps more into how they're rendering things internally. And then they give you all the properties and things like that. And they've got a bunch of other things in here. So, you know, your question on memory for iOS. If I had a really good way of, you know, forcing it to leak, I would try that. But logging, you can see with the timeline or with a logger. So anything that would come out to the device system logs out of, or to logcat.
That shows like slow frames.
Yep. Yep.
These dev tools, is that something new? I've never seen any videos about that.
They came out earlier this year. I'm not sure if they're in Android Studio yet or if they're just part of VS Code. And I can't remember if there was an experimental flag I had to turn on to get to them. But there's documentation on it that's out there.
It's in the toolbar button now.
Is it?
Yeah, it's the very most right button in your VS Code.
Huh. Nice.
I think it's just a Flutter thing.
That just happened last few weeks.
Okay. I've been in Xcode the last few weeks, so I haven't noticed. But, you know, the entire application that, you know, this, you know, the showing Android is all the same code we looked at before. You know, I got my platform widget, which creates a method channel, you know, performs something asynchronously, gets a reply back, and updates the UI state. And then on the Android side, you know, whenever I say get platform, it returns Android. So the code's legit, copied and pasted right out of the IDEs.
So now that you're switching around, can you show us some live reloading?
Yeah. So let's bring this over here. And here's VS Code. And we're going to make my platform widget disappear. And I'm going to turn off that view debugging. And I'm going to make it reappear. And I'm going to go through and wrap it in a container and set its color to be colors.red. So, sub-second. I want to add some padding to it.
margin, edge, insets geometry, edge insets dot all 16.0. That's not really what I want, so let's do padding. Yep. So imagine doing that on Android or iOS. You know, if you can trust the previewer, you can maybe get through some of this pretty quickly. This is a real running code.
So when you say the container has to be a specific size, does that mean you can't do dynamic size containers at all?
You can. If you're doing it with a platform view, you would probably want to send a message or a method call down saying, how big would this button need to be?
Okay.
Get that back, and then use that to instantiate your platform view.
That's with Android, screen sizes and everything being different.
Yeah.
You have to be able to handle. If you have a button that you want to stretch across the entire width of the bottom of the device, that is not as static, depending on what.
Right. So, so this one would be cross-axis, so alignment, stretch.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't. The view itself. Okay.
Flutter has built-in like get display size stuff in it too. So if you wanted something that was like a tenth of the height and the whole width, you could just ask like, what are my display metrics? Do math on it yourself in Dart code, and then build your platform view with that stuff.
I see. Okay.
So, yeah, kind of expanding what he said. We've got let's put another text view down here. Text with is going to be, let's do media query dot of context dot do size dot width dot toString. So if you're looking to do anything dynamic with the screen dimensions, you can figure.
Okay.
Or so this screen is 414 points high or wide, or 896 points tall.
Okay. So you can just get that from.
Yep.
Okay.
And then from there, if you need to build like your own layout manager or whatever, you can do that too.
Set it to whatever you.
Yep. But instead of doing it twice, you get to do it once. So unless you really, really like doing that, building those types of things.
No.
Yeah.
So if you had a big enough monitor, can you run this on Android and iOS at the same time as the library loading settings? Or is it just one?
Because you asked. So we're gonna, let's stop this. I'm gonna do Flutter run device all.
Yeah, but you.
Don't get me started, man. So you're gonna take the initial hit while it builds the Android app, pushes it out. It's gonna build the iOS app, push it out.
So you use Xcode for all your Flutter stuff, and then.
I'm using
or not Xcode. but
VS Code.
VS Code for your Flutter stuff, Xcode for your iOS stuff. And then, okay.
Yep. I think that VS Code is a stronger IDE for Flutter than Android Studio. So let's see, we're gonna change red. How quickly do you think this will work, Adam?
I'm going to assume so since you're doing this.
Oh, because it's still building the Xcode project. Oh.
So is it still running the old one? Or?
Yep. Give it a second. So let's try green. Oh, I've got to reload it down here. If you're running it across all the devices, you don't get the automatic push the changes over from the editor. You got to hit it from down here. But so let's do green. Reload it. Yellow. Reload it.
I can imagine, like, if you could do this on one, you could do this on 16 different test Get your Mac Pro.
And this is why my next MacBook Pro is going to have 64 gigs of RAM. Not yet. So yeah. If you had a phone,
Need a Mac Pro.
so we had an iPhone 5S simulator, we had an iPhone XR simulator, and we had an iPad simulator all running at the same time. We're doing this. So as we're checking to see how things worked, we weren't busting things on one side, playing whack-a-mole. We still play whack-a-mole, but we've got to play it faster.
Does Flutter have a min SDK it recommends? Like how far does it go back?
They go back farther than I want to.
Okay.
Oh, min SDK 23 and above. Or higher.
26.
26? I like it. Let's make it so.
We're at 21. That's 23.
Hmm?
Yeah, we're
23 is the min.
I think they go back farther than that.
I think you can go back to like 40.
I think it went back to iOS 8 or 9 too.
Yeah. And all of our stuff has been Android 23 and above and iOS 12 and above, so.
Yeah. Well, if you're using a plugin, then change.
Yeah.
It's all kinds of stuff.
Kind of going back to your question on the automated testing, when we're thinking about the encryption stuff that we did, we had tests around all of that encryption stuff, but all we had to do was make sure that that part was working, and then just that it was getting called. So you're not prevented from doing automated testing. It's just different types. And then if you're looking for a good presentation on how to do automated testing with Flutter, check YouTube coming in the next few weeks, maybe.
But we are supposed to have all of our hard test presentations. We upload them to YouTube. How's accessibility? How is accessibility?
Great.
Somebody that bumps up their system font gets very
Nope. So iOS, let's try that. Shouldn't those fonts have gotten bigger too? Shouldn't these fonts have gotten bigger? No?
No.
Yep. So all the sizes in here are relative to users' preferences and then independent of screen density.
Your iOS button did not, that's because it doesn't default to a dynamic font.
Yep. Yep. This one is coming out of the, if I went over to Xcode and changed the style of the button to reference one of the dynamic sized things, it would take care of it, but that's a bug for the iOS developer to go figure out. Hmm?
That's you though, right?
Yeah. I'll put on my other hat.
Would you have to change the size of the container too, or?
Yeah.
So maybe don't use this for buttons.
I wonder if you did dot size dot somewhere they've got a text scale factor. So I could take the button height and let's grab that and go to platform rendered button, the height times there. There you go, Alex.
So, is it like kanji, it's going to be a different size? So text scale factor, that's a position on the slider? I don't know if that.
Yeah. So the text. So kind of going back to.
I'm just thinking about localization because it's more, it's the buddy of accessibility. And so, kanji is a different size character set than, say, Roman character set.
Yeah.
So I'm just starting to wonder about that. But I guess I just have to figure it out.
Yeah. Under the covers, if Flutter is drawing it, they'll figure out what the font metrics height is and use all of that.
Okay.
But yeah, as for this text scale factor, it directly impacts that slider. And then on Android, if we go to the device settings, accessibility, font size, crank it all the way up, go back into the app. Yep, everything got bigger. On the other accessibility side, they're tied in directly to the same type of accessibility navigation tree for like TalkBack and screen readers and things like that. So it's transparent to the user. Any other questions? This is fun. Trong.
This isn't specifically a Flutter question, but for VS Code, what plugins do you recommend for Flutter?
The Flutter plugin?
What?
The Flutter plugin?
like the other ones to make coding itself easier.
Oh,
Yeah, like some color one and some autocomplete boilerplate.
oh, those are actually built into it. So if I wanted to wrap this text thing, I'll hit, what is it, Command dot, and it pulls up a list of contextual refactorings specific to Flutter with where I'm at in that view tree. GetLens is useful. Yeah, I basically only use 2 plugins. So if we actually take a look at if I had another project, I've got our VS Code configuration checked into version control, and it's basically only 2 plugins. So everything they give you works really well out of the box, and debugging in here is great. So if I wanted to, because I'm running it out of here, it's not going to have the debugger attached. But if I was running the app directly from VS Code through its debugger mechanism, debugging and everything works exactly the way you'd expect. And I wonder if this will work.
One line up left.
Thank you. So I'm going to put a breakpoint there, and let's save something. Yep, debugger got hit, and I can see where everything's at.
Okay.
So this has a platform value of Android, which represents that. So no issues. That didn't work the last time I tried it, so that was.
Because you're using the hotfix.
I'm not sure. Any other questions? If not, I will wrap this up, and feel free to hang out here for a while if you're interested in going out and getting drinks later. I'm game for that. And thank you for coming out. And if you have any other questions, I'll put the slide deck up on Meetup later, but there's my email address, and then there's Twitter is about the only social network I use anymore, so super clever name for it too. So thanks.